The mule team shifted in their traces' hooves, scuffing the packed dirt as the crowd's restless murmur rolled through the summer heat. From the shade of the awning, I caught sight of her barefoot on a raised platform, wrists bound with coarse rope, the pale cotton of her dress torn at the neck. The auctioneer's voice rattled across the yard, his chant wrapping cruelty in the sing-song of a sale. Folks laughed when a miner tossed out a half-hearted bid, and the sound carried like grit in the wind. I hadn't planned to stop in Gravel Bend for more than a length of harness and a word at the bank. But I found myself at the back of that crowd, my boots rooted where the dust swirled, watching her scan the faces for something, anything other than malice. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood in a place where one decision might change the course of a life. My name's Cole Stratton. I was born east of the Mississippi, but I've spent most of my years under skies wide enough to swallow a man whole. My father ran freight in Missouri. My mother kept a home that smelled of fresh bread and lamp oil, and both believed a neighbor's hand was something you offered before it was asked for. By 20, I was driving my own wagons through the passes, hauling whatever a mining camp or a ranch might pay to have brought in barrels of flour, crates of tools, kegs of kerosene. It wasn't rich work, but it was steady, and out here steadiness could be worth more than gold. I'd built the White House beyond the cottonwoods with my wife Anna, thinking we'd raise our boy there and fill it with the sounds of family. But the West doesn't bargain. A stagecoach coming back from Carson City was robbed. Neither of them made it home. After that, I kept the place in good repair out of habit, not out of hope. Days began before the sun and ended with ledgers under lamplight, the mules and wagons my only company. Gravel Bend was a place where the money from mines and the reach of the railroad could make a man rich overnight, but it also had a way of showing the worst in folks when there was no one to stop them. I'd seen women traded between camps like tools boys worked to bone in the shafts, and too many townsfolk who figured it wasn't their concern. I had gotten used to keeping my head down unless the trouble came close enough to touch. But 8 years on from burying my family, the patience for looking away had worn thin. That morning had been meant for freight schedules and leather work, but word of a woman being sold alongside mules put my boots on a different path. I told myself I'd only look, only be certain it was true. But as I stood in that yard with the smell of dust and sun-baked rope in my nose, I knew better. The auctioneer's chant dipped, waiting for another bid. The men around me shifted, some amused, some calculating, none with kindness in their eyes. I felt the sun heavy on my shoulders and the weight of choice pressing harder. Somewhere beyond the boardwalk, a church bell marked the hour. The woman's gaze slid over the crowd, past me, then back again. And in that brief meeting of eyes, I knew the moment for looking away had passed. The sun held high over Gravel Bend, baking the boards of the auction platform until they gave off the faint scent of resin. Heat shimmered above the dirt yard where the animals stood roped and waiting. Horses twitched against flies in the shade. Mules shifted in the open, their tails cutting at the air. I stepped down from my buckboard, the leather of the reins warm in my hands, and looped them over a post. My boots sank a half-inch into dust that clung and would not let go. I hadn't meant to stop here for anything more than a harness and a quick word with the bank. But word had spread faster than good news ever did that they were selling a woman along with the livestock. By the time I reached the crowd, the auctioneer was already in full voice, a sing-song chant that made the whole thing sound like a card game. She stood barefoot on the platform, hands bound in front with coarse rope, the skin on her wrists rubbed raw. Her dress was askew, torn at the neckline. Her hair was long, dark, and tangled from travel, and a yellowing bruise marked her cheekbone. She didn't glare or plead. Her eyes moved over each man in the crowd, as if she were measuring which one might bring the worst of it. Bids came slow. $50 from a rancher near the front, $60 from a miner who shouted it like a joke. Laughter rolled through the yard, the kind that had no kindness in it. I'd seen enough freighters' camps and mining towns to know where this would end if she went to one of them. The chant stalled at 85. The auctioneer swept the crowd for more, but I didn't give him the chance. 200. My voice cut through the noise and left nothing but silence in its place. The auctioneer's grin widened, his gavel came down, and in that sharp crack, the deal was done. I stepped onto the platform, took a folding knife from my pocket, and cut the rope from her wrists. The fibers fell away, leaving faint red marks behind. "Come on," I said, keeping my tone even. She looked at me for a heartbeat, weighing something, then stepped down. We crossed the yard together. I didn't put a hand to her back or arm. I didn't need to. Folks moved aside on their own. At Tucker's leather shop, I bought her a plain pair of brown boots, making sure they fit before I paid. At the mercantile, I added a blanket, a tin cup, and a bar of soap. From there, we walked to the cook tent near the freight yard. I ordered stew and bread, set the plate in front of her, and took a seat across the table. She ate quickly at first, then slower, like she was waiting for someone to take it away. I let her finish without a word. Back at the buckboard, I steadied her as she climbed up. The wheels rolled over dry ruts until the town's false fronts shrank to a line against the pale sky. Cottonwoods marked the turnoff to my place. The white frame house stood back from the road porch, shaded shutters straight. I'd built it years before with my wife, planning for a family we never got to finish raising. Since then, it had stayed neat because that's what habit does. I pulled the team up at the gate and stepped down, offering her my hand. The air carried the scent of cut hay from the pasture. Inside the rooms were cool floors, swept furniture polished. There was no sign of a woman's work here. No apron on a hook, no mending left on a chair, but every shelf and table was set as if for company. I led her to a back room with a proper bed, clean quilt, a basin and pitcher, and a folded calico dress on the chair. "This is yours. You can wash up when you're ready." "There's food in the kitchen," I said, and stepped into the hallway. Alone, she closed the door halfway, set the blanket on the bed, and washed the trail from her skin. The calico fit at the waist, the neckline lower than she might have chosen, but it was whole and clean. When she stepped into the kitchen, I was already at the table with 2 plates, bread beans, and coffee. We ate in the quiet, the only sound the clink of cutlery and the ticking of the wall clock. Afterward, I took her plate, set it in the sink, and nodded toward the back door. Porch is cooler this time of day. Outside, the late lights softened the yard. From the steps, she could see the freight shed, wagons, undercover mules, and the corral. I leaned against the rail. "You'll be safe here. No one comes in without me letting them." She didn't answer, but for the first time her eyes met mine without sliding away. That night I carried a spare mattress into the hallway outside her door. She stood in the doorway as I unrolled a blanket over it. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I do," I replied, and left it at that. The lamps went out. She lay in bed listening for boots, fists, keys, and locks. None came. The only sound was my breathing outside her door. Morning came clear and dry, the air carrying the smell of coffee and soap. I slid a plate toward her: eggs, fried potatoes, a heel of bread. No questions about how she slept. When I finished, I handed her a folded cloth. "If you want to wash up the dishes, the pump's good. If you don't, leave them. I'll be at the yard." From the doorway, she watched me cross to the shed. She kept the house in sight as she moved from room to room, the door frames always in the corner of her eye. On a shelf, she found 2 framed pencil drawings, a woman and a boy. She set them back exactly as they'd been and turned to the dishes. At the pump, the water ran cool over her wrists. On the shelf by the stove, she found the freight ledger. Lines of receipts and dates matched the routes I ran kerosene to Aurora Flour to Carson City. One mine account didn't match the banknote pinned to it. She left it open. I came in near noon for a canteen and saw what she'd seen. "You read English," I said. She nodded once. "My father traded. He made me learn. This one is short $10. "Good catch," I told her. "I'll handle it." Before stepping out again, I set a small canvas bag by the door. "If you need anything from town, write it down. You don't have to ask. I bought you to stop what was coming next. You're not a servant. You're not a prisoner. If you stay, it's because you choose it. If you leave, I won't send anyone after you. But there are men who'll look for you. If you stay here, I can keep them out." She stood quiet for a long moment, then said, "I'll stay for now." I nodded. "There's food on the shelf. Take what you want." At the door, I paused. "What should I call you, Nayeli?" she said. "Cole," I answered, though she'd already heard it in town. The day took shape. She swept, shook out rugs, mended the loose seam in my coat. Each thing she noticed, the unlocked doors, the mattress in the hall, the lack of questions, seemed to take a small weight from her chest. Near sundown, I came back with the set of a man tired from work, not drink. She had beans simmering and bread warmed through. Our hands touched when she set the cup by my plate, and neither of us pulled away. "Tomorrow I'll see the sheriff," I told her. "We'll put a statement on record about what happened at the yard. I'll write a release that says you owe me nothing. I should have done it this morning." She met my eyes. "I will go with you. I don't want them to say I was hiding." "All right," I said, and that settled it. After supper, I checked the windows and doors, filing down the sticking latch on her window until it closed clean. She handed me my coat. The lining was torn. I fixed it. I ran my thumb over the stitches. "Looks better than before." We moved to the porch while the light faded over the hills. "I'll pay you for the bookkeeping if you want the work," I said. "Same as any clerk." She looked at the road, then back at me. "Yes." I took off my vest and set it over her shoulders when the air cooled. She held it closed, and we stayed there until the yard went dark. The next morning came warm, and still the kind of air that clung to the skin before the sun was high. I had the wagon team hitched early, the mules shifting in place as though they could tell we'd be gone a while. Nayeli stepped out from the kitchen, wearing the calico again, her hair tied back in a loose braid, the new boots softening at the creases. "We'll head into town first," I told her. "Sheriff, then the bank. After that, I'll bring the harness you looked at yesterday." Her brow tightened slightly. "I didn't ask for it. I set one boot on the hub to check the harness strap." "You looked long enough to want to," I said, letting the corner of my mouth tilt before offering her my hand up to the bench. The road into Gravel Bend was quiet, but for the steady clip of hooves. A freight wagon passed heading east, the driver lifting 2 fingers in greeting. The false fronts of town grew from the pale horizon, saloon doors swinging in the morning heat, 2 boys sweeping the boardwalk in front of the mercantile. I kept the team moving until we stopped outside the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Dobbs straightened in his chair when he saw me, then looked past my shoulder to Nayeli. His pause told me he already knew the talk that had gone around. "I'm putting a statement on record," I said. "She was sold at the yard 2 days ago. I paid to stop it. No debts owed. She's free from that moment." He took a sheet of paper from his desk. "You want this formal?" "Yes," I said, then glanced at her. "Sign with me." She took the pen, holding it like she'd held one before, and wrote her name in careful strokes. Dobbs stamped the paper, the sound sharp in the small room. "It's official," he said, handing each of us a copy. From there, we crossed to the mercantile. I settled the missing $10 from the ledger she'd spotted the day before. The storekeeper gave me a puzzled look when I mentioned it, but he counted the coins without question. Nayeli stood just behind me, drawing the occasional glance from customers. When we stepped back into the street, I noticed she kept her head up, eyes forward. We passed the rise where the cemetery sat under a stand of cottonwoods. I slowed the mules and turned them toward the fence. Two headstones stood side by side, the ground kept clear of weeds. My wife and boy, I said quietly. That's why the house is the way it is. Why it's too quiet sometimes. She didn't answer. She stepped down, resting her hand on the fence rail, and stayed there until the wind shifted and the leaves whispered above us. When she climbed back to the bench, she gave me a single look, and I knew she'd taken in more than words. By the time we rolled into the yard, the sun had dropped low. She went inside to start supper. I unhitched the team and rubbed the mules down. In the kitchen, the air smelled of beans and fresh bread. I set a folded paper beside her plate. Keep this with you in case anyone asks. She touched the edge. Do you think they will? Maybe. But now you have the answer. Later, with the lamps lit, I brought a small parcel from the shelf. Inside was a plain, dark blue dress. Thought you should have one that fits right, I said, if you want it. She looked up. Why? Because you're not going back in rags. That night she left her door open a little wider than before. The days began to take on a rhythm. I left before sunup to oversee the freight yard. She kept the house, learned the ledger routes, and by week's end could recite schedules without checking the page. One evening I came in with a small package from town, wrapped in brown paper. Stopped by the store. Thought you might use this. It was a wool shawl, dark gray, soft in her hands. Why do you keep buying me things? She asked. Because you didn't come here with anything worth keeping. That doesn't sit right with me. Over supper, her eyes went to the framed drawings she'd seen before. Who are they? She asked. I set down my fork. My wife Anna and our son Matthew. Stagecoach was coming back from Carson City. Robbers took it. Neither made it home. She was quiet, letting the words settle. You built that house for them? Yes. And for a long time it felt like I built it for nothing. Until now. That night, a storm rolled in. Wind rattled the shutters. Rain struck the roof in bursts. One shutter banged hard enough to startle her. I crossed the room, fastened it, and set my coat around her shoulders. You're safe here, I said, steady and sure. She caught my wrist, her fingers warm against my skin. Cole. I looked down, waiting. She didn't speak again, just held my eyes. I brushed my thumb along her fingers, giving her time to pull away if she chose. She didn't. I bent, kissed her, slow, nothing taken. She didn't choose to give. When we stepped apart, she kept the shawl close, and I went to unroll the mattress in the hall. The storm eased toward morning, leaving the ground damp and the air cool. We shared breakfast in quiet, but it wasn't the strained silence of strangers. It was the kind where small glances carried more than words. Afterward, I told her I'd be heading into town to settle a mine account and check the next freight run. You can come or stay here, I said. I'll come, she answered. Better they see me with you than make up their own stories. The mules carried us steady along the road. She kept her eyes forward, but I saw her take in how I watched the ridges. Why, she asked. You learn to see who's coming before they get close enough to mean trouble. In town, we stopped at the bank, then the general store. Men who had once stared at her now looked and turned away. Outside, a pair of ranch hands leaned on the hitch rail. One muttered, the other laughed. I turned toward them. Say it louder if you want me to answer. They looked elsewhere. By afternoon, we were back at the house. She put away supplies. I stacked fresh firewood against the wall. When I came inside, she handed me a cloth to wipe my hands. You didn't have to say anything back there, she said. I did. Not for me, so they know you're not standing alone. She nodded once, then took the freight ledger from the shelf and began reviewing the accounts. I brought a small box from the cabinet and set it on the table. Inside was a silver locket. It was Anna's, I said. Been in a drawer for years. If you want it, it's yours. She opened it, finding a scrap of handwriting folded inside. She closed it gently, holding it in her lap. We sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. The air cooled, and I rested my hand briefly over hers where it lay on the arm of her chair. She didn't move it away. In that quiet, I knew the next steps we'd take would matter. The next morning carried a dry wind off the ridge, sweeping dust across the yard and rattling the porch rail. I was outside early, checking harness lines, when Nayeli stepped onto the porch. She wore the dark blue dress, the silver locket resting above the neckline, her braid over one shoulder. She moved with the settled air of someone who had decided not to appear as if she'd only just arrived. Over breakfast, I told her I'll be gone most of the day. Delivery run. I'll be back after dark. You'll be all right here? She gave a short nod. I'll be fine. You've made sure of that. After I left, the house was quiet enough for her to hear the wind at the windows. She kept to her work, reviewing the freight ledgers, cross-checking figures, and sorting receipts into neat piles. By midday, she'd spotted another inconsistency: 2 barrels of lamp oil unaccounted for. She wrote a note to show me later. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from the table. When she opened it, a man stood on the porch, his hat low and his clothes dusted red from the mining camps. He looked her over before speaking. "You're the one Stratton bought?" She held the edge of the door. "I'm the one who works here." He tilted his head, a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard some folks say you're free now." "That's so." "It is," she answered. "Free's a hard thing to keep out here," he said. "You ever want different company? There's camps up north that pay better than keeping books." She closed the door on his words, turning the lock until it clicked hard in the frame. From the window, she watched him cross the yard and take the trail toward town. It was the first time trouble had come to the house instead of waiting somewhere beyond it. She stayed inside until the light began to go, then set supper on the stove. I came in after dark, trail dust still on my shirt. My eyes went to the lock before she even spoke. "Someone came by," she told me, and gave his description. My jaw tightened, but my voice stayed even. "I know the type. He won't be back." I didn't explain how I knew, and she didn't ask. After we ate, she handed me the slip of paper about the missing oil. I read it, folded it once, and slid it into my pocket. "You've got a sharper eye than anyone I've hired before." She studied me. "You trust me with this work. I trust you with more than that," I said, and left it there. Later, we sat in the front room with the lamp turned low. The air had cooled enough that the silence between us felt settled, not empty. I reached for her hand where it rested in her lap. My thumb traced lightly over the back. She didn't move away. I could tell the questions she'd carried from the day of the auction were finding their answers one by one. The next morning, I was quieter than usual, keeping an eye on the road as I worked the yard. She brought me coffee, and I told her, "If you're worried he'll come back, then we face it together." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll go into town after the morning run." Set it straight with anyone still wondering. By midday, the wagon rolled down Gravel Bend's main street with the 2 of us side by side. My presence alone drew attention, but Nayeli in the dark blue dress, sitting straight-backed, made every head turn. I didn't slow until we reached the sheriff's office. Inside, I told Dob about the man who had come to the house, giving his name. The sheriff wrote it down and said he'd pass word that anyone bothering her would answer to the law and to me, though he didn't need to say it aloud. When we stepped outside, I took the long way back to the wagon, past the saloon and the store, past the porches where men sat and pretended not to stare. A few tipped their hats. None said a word against it. Back home, the air had the feel of evening settling in. We shared a quiet meal, the kind where the clink of cutlery and the faint hum of the stove filled the space. Afterward, I went to the bedroom and returned with a small box. I set it on the table in front of her. Inside was a plain gold ring. "I'm not a man for speeches," I said. "But I don't want you here on my word alone. I want you here as my wife. By choice." She looked at the ring, then at me. "You're asking now when I could still walk away. That's the only way it means anything." Her answer was simple. Yes. I slid the ring onto her finger, my hand steady, my eyes holding hers. The moment felt settled, as if the last of the old bargains had been closed. The weeks that followed moved with the freight runs, the sound of mules in harness, and the steady order of the yard. In town, no one spoke of the auction anymore. They spoke of the Strattons and the freight business. At home, the two empty chairs at the table were no longer reminders of loss. One was hers now. By the first cool days of autumn, I noticed changes in her: more tired in the mornings, her appetite coming earlier in the day. She waited until she was sure before saying anything. One evening, as I poured coffee, she set her hand over mine. "We'll need one more chair soon." I stopped, looked at her. "You're certain?" She nodded. My hand turned to cover hers completely. "Then we'll be ready." The house beyond the cottonwoods had gone from a place I kept out of habit to one with the weight and warmth of a family. Whatever came next, it would be met here. By late October, the mornings came with frost on the fence rails and the sound of the cottonwood leaves breaking loose in the wind. The freight yard was quieter between runs, which left me more time at the house than the work usually allowed. Nayeli's days had taken on their own order ledgers, in the morning mending by the window where the sun reached and keeping the kitchen warm with something simmering on the stove. The gold ring I'd placed on her finger caught the light. Whenever she moved her hands, a small glint that seemed to belong here as much as she did. One morning I came in from the yard with a folded letter in my coat pocket. The bank in Carson City had sent notice that a mining outfit to the north had fallen behind on its freight payments. I set the letter on the table beside her ledger. "We'll need to ride up there before the month's out. See if we can settle it before it turns into a court matter." She nodded, marking a figure in the margin. "How far? 2 days each way if the weather holds?" Her hand rested briefly over the page before she looked up. "Then we'd best go soon." We left before sunup 2 mornings later, the wagon loaded light, only what we needed for the road. The air was sharp enough to make the mule's breath show in clouds. Nayeli sat beside me under the gray wool shawl, her eyes on the line, where the ridge met the sky. We stopped at a small way station halfway to the mine. The keeper, Amos Reed, a man in his 50s with a limp from a horse fall years back, brought us coffee in tin mugs. "Road's clear to the north," he said. "But there's been talk of drifters working the camps for whatever they can take." I thanked him, and we moved on. By the time we reached the mining camp, the sun had dropped behind the slope, leaving the yard in shadow. The foreman, a tall, spare man named Frank Dillard, met us outside the office. His handshake was quick, his eyes sharper than his words. "We've been meaning to send for you, Stratton. Things have been thin lately." Inside, the air smelled of lamp oil and damp stone. Nayeli sat at the corner desk while Dillard brought out the account books. She turned the pages without hurry, tracing a figure here, a date there. "This delivery," she said, tapping the column, "is marked as paid twice." Dillard frowned. "Must be a mistake." It took an hour to work through the rest. In the end, the total due was smaller than the letter had claimed. Dillard signed the agreement and counted out the coins on the desk. He didn't look pleased about it, but the papers were in order. We stayed the night in the camp's guest quarters, bare boards, thin blankets, but a roof over our heads. In the morning, we started back. On the second day, clouds gathered over the ridge, the wind carrying the smell of snow. We pushed the mules until the house came into view through the bare branches. Inside, the warmth from the stove met us at the door. Nayeli moved through the rooms, setting things to rights, as though she'd been gone longer than a week. I stacked my coat and gloves by the door, then joined her in the kitchen. After supper, she set her hand on my arm. Frank Dillard didn't like me going through his books. I met her eyes. He liked the idea of paying even less, a whole lot less. That's done now. She nodded, but I could tell the thought of it was still close. I changed the subject. There's a church social in town next week. If you want to go, we can. She hesitated only a moment. Yes. It's time they see us outside the yard. The night of the social, the town hall was warm from the stove lamplight spilling across the wooden floor. The tables held pies, jars of preserves, and baskets of bread. Conversations quieted some when we stepped inside. But no one turned away. Sheriff Dobb tipped his hat. A few women from the mercantile nodded in greeting. We spent an hour there talking with neighbors, listening to the fiddle music. When we left, the air outside was cold enough to sting the lungs, but her hand in mine was steady. At home, I banked the fire while she set the locket on the dresser. "You've made this house feel different," I said. She glanced at me over her shoulder. "So have you." I didn't press for more. Some truths didn't need to be stretched into words. The next morning brought a thin crust of snow on the ground. I was in the yard checking the harness shed when I saw a rider pause at the gate. He sat a bay gelding, a scarf pulled up against the wind. From where I stood, I couldn't see his face, but I could tell by the way he waited in the saddle that he wasn't here for freight business. The rider at the gate sat his bay gelding without moving, the wind tugging at the scarf over his mouth. I stepped out from the harness shed, brushing the dust from my hands. "You looking for freight work?" I asked. He pulled the scarf down, showing a narrow face, the kind that didn't give away much. "Name's Calvin Briggs," he said. "I've got word for your wife." Nayeli came to the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind. Briggs tipped his hat to her, then reached into his coat and brought out a folded note. "From a woman up toward the reservation line. Said she knew you from before." Nayeli took it without speaking, her fingers careful on the paper. Briggs gave a short nod to me. Message delivered. He turned his horse without waiting for an answer, the sound of hoofbeats fading down the road. Inside, Nayeli set the note on the table and opened it. Her eyes moved over the lines, once then again. "It's from a woman named Ada Begay. She says one of the men who raided my village is working in a freight crew near the North Spur." I leaned on the table, the wood cool under my palms. "You know him?" "Yes," she said quietly. I remember his voice. We sat with it for a moment, the only sound the faint rattle of the stove lid. "If we go up there, it can't be for a fight," I told her. "But if he's done more than work mules, we'll bring it to the sheriff." She nodded once. "I just need to see him, to know it's him." The next morning, we were on the road north. The air had turned clear and sharp after the windstorm, the ground hard under the wagon wheels. By midday, we passed the split where the telegraph line veered west. The freight camp came into sight near a stand of bare willows, canvas tents flapping in the breeze. A man at the edge of the yard pointed us toward the foreman. He was a heavy-set fellow named Roy Harlan, his coat collar turned up against the cold. "You looking for work or delivery?" he asked. "Neither," I said. "We're checking on a name Jonas Fitch." "We heard he was here." Harlan's eyes flicked toward the corral. "He's been driving one of the supply teams." "Why old debt?" I said, keeping it flat. Nellie stayed by my side as we crossed the yard. Fitch was coiling a length of rope near the lead mule, his hands quick as head bent. When he looked up, the years fell away for her, and I saw it in the way she went still. His eyes caught hers for the briefest moment before sliding past, like he hadn't seen her at all. But I caught the tightening in his jaw. We didn't speak to him there. Instead, I went back to Harlan. "If you can spare him, I'd like to take Fitch into town for a word with Sheriff Dobb." Harlan studied me, then shrugged. "So long as he's back by morning." The ride into Gravel Bend was quiet. Fitch sat on the back bench of the wagon hands, resting on his knees, eyes on the road. At the sheriff's office, Dobb looked from me to Nellie, then to Fitch. "What's this about?" I said. "She can tell you." Nellie stepped forward, her voice steady. She told the sheriff about the night her village burned, the horses taken, the people scattered. "He was there," she said, pointing to Fitch. "I heard him give orders." Fitch shifted in his chair. "I was hired to drive wagons. Didn't know what they'd do." Dobb leaned forward. "But you stayed when you saw it." Fitch didn't answer. The sheriff sat back. "I can't hang him on your word alone, but I can send word to the county judge. He'll answer for what he did." We left Fitch in the cell and stepped back into the cold. The sky had gone pale with the light fading over the ridge. Nellie pulled her shawl tighter, her breath showing in the air. "Thank you," she said simply. I nodded and we walked back to the wagon. The road home was quiet except for the creak of the boards and the rhythm of the mules. By the time we reached the house, the lamps inside cast a warm glow through the windows. I unhitched the team while she went in to set the stove going. Over supper, she said I thought I'd feel more when I saw him. Anger, maybe. But it was just knowing he couldn't pretend I didn't remember. I set my cup down. Sometimes that's enough to start with. She gave a small nod, and we finished the meal without more talk on it. Later, as I banked the fire, the sound of a horse came up the road. Hooves slowed, then stopped at the gate. I stepped to the window. A rider sat there in the half-light, the scarf at his throat lifting in the wind. Whoever he was, he hadn't come for freight business. The rider at the gate didn't call out. I stepped onto the porch, the lantern light catching on the brass of his saddle horn. He lifted his hat enough for me to see his face. It was Deputy Tom Keating from Gravel Bend. "Sheriff sent me," he said. "Fitch broke out of the holding cell just before dawn. Took a mule and headed south." My hand tightened on the porch post. He armed Keating nodded. Took one of the rifles from the rack. Nellie came to stand beside me, her shawl drawn tight. "South?" she asked quietly. Keating glanced her way. "That's what the tracks show. Sheriff figured you'd want to know. I'll be riding with 2 others to try and catch him. I told him we'd keep watch here." After he left, the night felt sharper. I checked the barn, made sure the rifles were loaded, and set the lantern by the door. Nellie stayed near the kitchen window, watching the road that cut across the flats. Every creak of the windmill made her turn her head. By morning, a light snow had dusted the yard. I saddled the bay and rode to the ridge east of the house. From there, I could see the faint trail of mule prints heading toward the old freight road. Something in my gut told me he wasn't just passing through. I was halfway back when I saw smoke rising from the line shack near the cottonwoods. The place had been empty since autumn. I left the bay in a draw and went the rest of the way, on foot keeping low. Through the cracks in the wall, I saw Fitch moving inside a saddlebag, open on the table. I eased the door open, rifle in hand. "Step away from that bag." He froze, then slowly raised his hands. "Ain't looking for trouble," he said. But his eyes never left mine. "You found it anyway," I told him. "Sheriff's on your trail." Before I could move him outside, a sound behind me made us both turn. Nellie stood in the doorway, her face calm, her shawl falling from one shoulder. Why, she asked Fitch. Her voice was steady, but the question hung in the cold air between them. Fitch swallowed, glancing from her to the open door. "You wouldn't understand." She stepped closer. "I understand more than you think. You burned my home. You took my people. And now you run again." He looked down, his shoulders sagging. I kept the rifle on him while we walked back to the draw. By the time we reached the house, Keating and 2 other riders were coming up the road. They took Fitch without a word, binding his hands and leading the mule away. As the sound of hooves faded, Nellie stood beside me, her breath white in the cold air. "It's finished," she said, though her eyes stayed on the empty road. I put my hand over hers, the leather of my glove rough against her skin. That evening the wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the town. The telegraph line hummed faintly in the stillness. I had just set another log on the fire when hoofbeats sounded again in the yard. This time it was no deputy. A rider dismounted, a sealed envelope in his hand. "From the county judge," he said. "He'll be riding in to come morning." The county judge arrived just after sunrise, his coat collar turned up against the bite in the wind. He stepped down from the buckboard with the sure gait of a man who'd traveled this circuit for years. In his hand was the sealed envelope I'd been handed the night before. We met at the kitchen table, the morning light slanting through the frosted glass. Nieli sat across from me, her shawl still around her shoulders. The judge broke the seal, laid out the documents, and spoke in that even tone of his. The land was ours proper, and binding with every right protected under the law. Fitch's name would be struck from any claim, and his crimes would stand on record. Nieli's eyes lowered, and I saw the faintest tremor in her hands. For a long while she said nothing, only listening as the judge finished reading. When he closed the folder, she thanked him with a quiet dignity that filled the room more than any loud words could have. By midday, the buckboard was gone, its wheels crunching over the frozen ruts down the lane. The house seemed warmer somehow, though the wind still pushed against the walls. We walked the fence line together, the snow creaking under our boots. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and far off, I could hear the faint ring of a blacksmith's hammer in town. That evening we lit the lamps early. Nieli stood by the hearth, looking at the fire. "It's different now," she said softly. I knew she didn't just mean the deed or the land. She meant the space we had made here, safe and ours. In the days that followed, life settled back into its steady rhythm. The barn doors swung open at first light, the stock fed and watered the coffee pot, always ready on the stove. The telegraph lines hummed faintly in the distance, carrying news that no longer threatened to shake our footing. Looking back, I reckon justice out here never came easy, and it never came quick. But when it did, it was like a slow dawn over the hills, quiet, certain, and worth every cold mile you'd ridden in the dark. We'd faced what came held to what mattered, and found ourselves still standing. If you've been listening this far, maybe you've known your own long ride toward a just ending. And maybe you found, like we did, that the truest home is the one you claim with your own hands. Thank you for riding along with our story. If it's left you thinking, or brought someone to mind, I hope you'll share it. There's always room at the fire for another tale.